Welcome to FWTV. My name is Zach and I will be your host for the day. We will be focused on historical impacts, globalization, and legacies left behind from the fur wars in North America. The fur trade has had everlasting impacts on the world to this day, from creating new religions and cultures to devastating and destroying cultures. The fur trade initially started in the early 1600s. When Europeans came to North America, it began on the East Coast. It can be said that it really started in 1492 when Christopher Columbus first arrived in Canada, and the exchange of ideas and other goods began. Europeans initially established colonies all along the East Coast, which was easier to access from Europe. The Cree, Huron, and Iroquois played vital roles in exchange of goods, as they were the main providers of furs in the Europeans. Furs in Europe were of very high value and were commodities that very few had access to. North America allowed Europe a steady supply of beaver pelts and other furs that no longer existed in Europe, as they had become extinct in Europe.
European ships coming to Canada.
Europe's four main globalization dimensions apply to economic, social, political, and environmental. For the economic dimension, they had monopolies on the fur trade in North America, making them extremely wealthy. For society, they created a new culture now known as the Métis. This was by intermarriage between the fur trades and First Nation women. Europe asserted their political structure over America, controlling it and overpowering many of the First Nations that had lived there for centuries. Due to the high value of beaver pelts and other animals in America, they were overhunted to the brink of extinction.
Buffalo furs.
Indigenous groups in North America's four main globalization dimensions applied to economic, social, political, and environmental conditions were much more negatively impacted than Europe's. Their economies had a new supply of goods and materials that they could use to trade, but guns were also brought to North America, which created wars between groups. They were assimilated by many Europeans and put in residential schools in order to change their cultures and identities. New laws and rules were put over them, which they had no say in, as Europeans now controlled much of their lives. The Europeans who had come depleted many of the natural resources they had grown to care for and love.
Why did France and Britain want to control the goods of America? Britain and France sought wealth. The Americas supplied this wealth and allowed them to grow their communities massively. They used the colonies they created to acquire raw resources that they could buy cheap. The mother countries, Britain and Spain, used the colonies as they could, but bought raw resources for cheap and sold those resources back to the colonies after they had been processed. The colonies and indigenous groups in North America relied on the mother nations for these processed resources, as they were not allowed to process them. The Europeans sought to spread Christianity to the First Nations people. At the time, Europeans saw these First Nations groups as uncivilized, and we now know that they had a very complex ways of life and had highly developed societies that rivaled those of Europeans.
Photo demonstrating how colonies supplied the mother country.
The legacies left behind from the Fur War. Number 1. Marginalization and displacement. First Nations people were pushed off the lands that they had thrived on and lived on for centuries so that European hunters could hunt and sell furs as well as set up colonies. They lost practices that they had used for centuries due to the inclusion of new European technologies. Number 2. Assimilation. The Métis culture was created during this time between the intermarriages between fur traders and First Nations women, but countless cultures were destroyed and assimilated. Languages were lost due to English and French becoming the dominant languages in America. Evidence for this. First Nations people are still fighting for their land to this day. They continue to advocate for their land, cultures, and languages that were taken away by the Europeans.
Represents the assimilation that occurred in the residential schools.
Alright, so has enough been done to address what has been done to the Indigenous peoples in Canada? Yes, they have done enough. Efforts are taking place by acknowledging that First Nations have lived here off these lands for centuries before us, and Europeans took that away from them. Their languages and cultures are being taught across Canada to try and revive what had been taken from them. Compensation have been created to help the Indigenous people. So they've done enough.
They have not done enough. Number 1. Many Indigenous communities have lots of poverty and are struggling, and they face many social disadvantages. Number 2. Some issues have never been resolved and are being avoided by Canadian society and government. Number 3. The legacies of historical policies, such as assimilation, still impact Indigenous people to this day, such as residential schools and the impact they've had on all First Nations people.
Indigenous cultures in Canada.
The 5 phases of the fur trade. Phase 1. Phase 1 of the fur trade began in 1500 and lasted until 1603 and started on the East Coast. Europeans started trading with the indigenous groups. The Europeans would trade goods such as metals and other European commodities, and the First Nations began to trade cod. The British set up trading stations along shore but did not establish any long-term settlements. Trade benefited both sides. First Nations saw trade as a way to build relationships of peace and friendships, and Europeans saw it as a way to grow their economy. Phase 2 of the fur trade. Phase 2 of the fur trade began in 1603 and lasted until 1670. During this time, Montreal and Quebec became the shipping centers for the fur trade, running up the St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes in Quebec. Furs were shipped back to France, and commodities from France were brought to North America. Furs and other trade items were transported to and from Montreal. During this time, France dominated the fur trade. It was the central economy for France, and New France was established as a colony in North America. French partnered with many indigenous groups such as the Wendat, Onedat, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Quechua. The Coureurs de Bois became the middleman, and they are independent traders. Catholic missionaries are sent to try and convert the First Nations to Catholicism. Many First Nations convert fully or keep some of their cultures. This way, they keep the relationships with the Europeans and keep trading for goods and commodities. The French Haudenosaunee War begins during this time. The French and its allies fought against the new allied Haudenosaunee, Dutch, and British. The British used the war to try to take over the fur trade that had been dominated by France. The French and their allies forced the Haudenosaunee to create a truce in 1701. Phase 3. Phase 3 began in 1670 and lasted until 1760. Britain established the Hudson's Bay Company in 1670. The Hudson's Bay Company was in direct competition with the French for the fur trade. In order to get the company running, they offered a group of merchants a monopoly on the fur trade in an area known as Rupert's Land. This was offered to the Hudson's Bay Company. The Hudson's Bay Company partnered with the Anishinaabe as middlemen. Phase 4 started in 1760 and ended in 1821. During this phase, New France became a British colony. The fur trade, which is now farmland, falls under the British system. The Northwest Company was also created during this time, and they took over the French trade networks which ran through St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes. The Northwest Company was owned by British merchants but depended on Canadian and Métis workers. Phase 5. Phase 5 began in 1821 and ended in 1870. The battles were over and the Northwest Company surrendered to the Hudson's Bay Company. The Hudson's Bay Company lost a court case against independent Métis traders that supplied pemmican and furs to America. Britain began to worry that the Americans might use these economic connections to gain control of Rupert's Land. Britain also started to worry that the Americans were going to team up with the Métis to take Rupert's Land. The buffalo began to disappear, beaver became scarce, and European demand for trade and furs began to fall. In 1869, Britain helped the Hudson's Bay Company negotiate the sale of its founding territory, Rupert's Land, to Canada.
These are our sources.